I want to talk about something that changed the way I think about sales completely. And it didn't come from some sales course or a closing framework or anywhere on YouTube per se. It actually came from a well-known book called The 48 Laws of Power. Maybe you've heard of it before. And the specific idea that I applied from that book directly to how I build and manage my sales teams comes to one simple idea, which is listen more than you talk. Now, when I started applying that principle to sales calls, everything changed in my business. Now, let's backtrack and look a little bit or see what a bad sales call looks like, because I hate to say it, I have sat in on hundreds of horrible sales calls. Now, a horrible sales call goes as follows. The salesperson basically gets on a call, does a quick introduction, asks 2 or 3 surface level questions, and then runs straight into the pitch. And for the next 20 to 30 minutes they are doing all the talking, right? They are explaining the product, listening to features, and handling objections that the prospect hasn't even raised yet, because the salesperson is so nervous about losing the deal that they're trying to cover every angle possible up front. And by the end of the sales call, the prospect is just exhausted. Why? Because they feel like they've been talked at and yapped at the whole time. And even if everything the salesperson was saying was true, right? And everything about the service or the product was genuinely perfect for the prospect is going to leave the call feeling like they were sold to rather than helped, right? And that feeling right there is what I pinpointed to being the deal killer. Because at the end of the day, nobody wants to feel like they've been sold to, right? I know Grant Cardone for once will say that, but at the end of the day, I don't agree with Grant Cardone's selling methodology, right? And especially in 2026, when buyers are more skeptical than ever and more sophisticated than they've ever been, right? And a few years back, I started paying attention to a specific metric that most sales leaders never track, and at least that I have ever seen. And that specific metric is talk time ratio. So essentially what it means is, how much of the call is the salesperson actually talking versus the prospect talking, right? And what I specifically found when I looked at the data is that basically what I found was that the reps that were doing or closing at the highest rates possible were always the ones that were talking the least, right? You would think that it's the opposite sometimes. Now, what I found specifically is my top reps, they talk between 30 to 40% of the time. And the rest of the call, the prospect was talking, right? So let's think about what that actually means. Because if your closer is only talking, 30 to 40% of the time on a sales call, what is the other, where's the other time going? Well, the prospect is talking, right? They are sharing their problems, their frustrations, their goals, their fears, and they are telling you exactly what they need to hear in order for them to say yes. And a great salesperson is listening to all of that and using it to ask the next question that takes the conversation one step deeper and closer to the sale. Now, a quick little hint, there is an actual an AI call recording software called Fathom that I would highly recommend all of your salespeople use right now. And the feature that I specifically like on that is basically once you're on a sales call, it has a pop-up and it will tell you exactly what your talk time is live on a call. And if you talk too much, it will basically start flashing at you, right? And I would recommend that everybody on your team basically uses that because, at the end of the day, as a closer, you are focusing on the prospect. You are focusing on what you're saying next. You're not necessarily thinking about what is my percentage of talk time here, right? So that actually gives your closer real feedback and live feedback as well. Now, here's basically, let's log in and basically see where the 48 laws of power comes in. Because one of the core ideas in that book is about, the power of silence and listening. And the principle is that, when you talk too much, you give away too much information, right? You reveal your position and basically, you hand the other person on the call the power, right? But here's what happens when you actually listen and when you ask questions and let the other person basically fill the silence, you learn everything that you need to know to maintain the frame of the call, right? Now, when I read that, I immediately thought about, every sales call I've ever sat in on where the rep was talking like 100 miles an hour, trying to overcome objections and close the deal, right? And I realized that they were doing actually the exact opposite of what this specific principle describes, right? And basically what they were doing was they were handing away all their power in the conversation by talking so much. And they were making the prospect feel pressured, right? And pressure makes people want to basically escape and run away, not buy from you, right? And the best salespeople I have ever worked with, they understand this instinctively, right? And the best salespeople, they already know this instinctively, right? And the best salespeople, in my opinion, that I have seen, they are the ones that are most comfortable with silence, right? They ask a question and, they aren't afraid to sit in silence and wait for the prospect to get back with them, right? They don't rush to fill the gap if there's a silence. They let the prospect think, respond, right, however long it takes, and reveal what's actually going on from this prospect, right? Because at the end of the day, you need to listen to your prospect to figure out what they need, right? And the silence there is actually where the real conversation happens. This is basically where you're going to find out, what the prospect actually cares about, right? And once you know that, the selling part almost becomes effortless because you are not convincing them of anything. You are just reflecting back at what they already told you what they need, right? And the specific term that I basically refer to this as consultative selling, right? And the difference between consultative selling and traditional selling is pretty simple, right? Now, in traditional selling, the salesperson basically comes onto the call with a script, a framework, and basically they have a predetermined destination because they are trying to move the prospect through a series of steps that ends up with a yes, right? And the prospect can basically feel the structure, and the moment they can feel the structure and the agenda, it makes them get defensive, right? Especially in B2B sales, right? Now, in B2B sales, consultative selling is the way to go, in my opinion, because in consultative selling, the salesperson comes into the call with one goal and one goal only, which is to understand whether they can actually help this person, right? And that is it. There's no script, there's no framework. There's just a genuine conversation where the salesperson is asking targeted questions and listening carefully to that answers, right? And here's the thing about that approach. When a prospect feels like they are being genuinely listened to and genuinely understood, they do not feel sold to. They feel helped, right? And people do not, resist when they are being helped. They welcome it, right? And the buying decisions in consultative selling almost always comes from the prospect themselves, right? The salesperson asks the right questions and the prospect talks through their own problems, right? Now, at the end of the day, that is where the conversation arrives, and where you need to take the conversation next is actually by listening to them, right? Because at the end of the day, the salesperson is not convincing them. They guide the prospect to their own conclusion, right? And that is the difference between a customer or a client who buys immediately and, a prospect that has buyer's remorse, or a client that has buyer's remorse. And, that is basically the two differences there. If you force somebody into a sale, right, they're going to have buyer's remorse and you're going to have chargebacks and so on and so forth, versus doing a consultative selling approach. The prospect feels like they made the buying decision, right? So your chargeback rate is going to be lower, your customer remorse is going to be lower, everything is going to be better for you at the end of the day, right? Now, when I train my salespeople, specifically in my team, this is the first thing that I work on with every new rep, right? First of all, I would listen to all their past call recordings, and I would use AI to figure out, how many questions did they actually ask in a 30-minute call versus how many statements were made, right? And I basically figure out exactly what that talk time ratio is between them talking and the prospect talking, right? And personally, I made it a habit in my own team to basically review the talk time after every single call. Not the close rate, but the talk time specifically. Because what I learned is if the talk time was right, the close rate will take care of itself, right? And, the two were almost directly correlated in my experience, those two KPIs, right? Now, the other thing that I made sure of is that I made 100% sure that my reps were comfortable, just sitting in silence, right? Because most salespeople, they are simply going to rush to fill the gap in the conversation because silence is basically going to feel like something is going wrong with the call, right? But the opposite is actually true, right? Because the silence on a sales call specifically, it basically means that the prospect is thinking, right? And thinking means that they are engaged, right? Because the worst thing you can do is interrupt that thinking process of the prospect. Now, in my own business, the reps who mastered this approach were, consistently the top performers. Not because they were the most technically skilled, but because they made every prospect feel genuinely heard and understood. And that feeling is worth more than, any closing technique or any kind of reframe possible, right? Now, the 48 Laws of Power is not a sales book, but the principle in it basically, or the principles in it directly apply to, how to influence people and, how it actually works between two people when you actually, listen to the other prospect and make them feel heard and understood, right? And the principle of listening more than you talk is literally one of the most powerful things you can bring to a sales call specifically. Now, if your sales team is struggling right now, before you look at their closing technique or any kind of objection handling skills, pull up a recording and count how many times they were talking, or just put it into AI and basically ask them what that talk time was. Like, how much did they talk versus the other prospect talking, right? Now, that number is going to tell you everything you need to know. Now, if you found this useful, consider subscribing. I post, stuff about building and managing world-class teams every single week because I talk to business owners every single day, and I come on here, share those lessons, the wins, and, everything else that is useful to me so we can all get better at our craft. And if you're looking at building a world-class sales team, but you don't want to go through the effort of finding them, recruiting them, vetting them, there should be a link up in the description somewhere where you can work with me one-on-one.